This morning we're going to be tying up a Barr's net building caddis. I'm going to start out with some 0.15 lead. I'm going to take quite a few wraps of this material, give it a little bit of extra weight, but it's also going to help us with the tapering a little bit. Once I've got that there, I'm just going to kind of rock it back and forth and get that to break off for me. And then I'll kind of make sure I'm holding this in place while I do the same thing with the back end. And that will end up getting us a nice clean band of lead on the fly here. And I'm going to push all of that up against the eye of the hook, which is what I often do. It just compresses those wraps just in case you've got them loose, just a helpful hint. From there, I'm going to draw the material backwards because I do want to keep an eye length, probably 2 eye lengths, in fact, back from the eye of the hook. For thread, I'm just going to turn to 14-aught sheer black. Go ahead and get ourselves started there. Pull my tag end back, and sometimes I'll stick my finger right where you see it just to help keep this lead from sliding further back down. And then I'll just go ahead and hop off the very end here. Take a few wraps back down around the bend. And we'll just come right back up again. This is all going to be covered up, so I'm not going to take a 1,000 thread wraps here in an effort to cover up the lead. I don't need to do that. So now that I've got that far, I'm going to go ahead and we're going to cut off our tag end. And we're going to go ahead and turn to our first material, which we're just going to use some white Z yarn. You can use antron. This is probably antron. But this is going to create a nice little stubby tail for us. I want to keep this on the top of my hook. I'm going to go ahead and wrap my thread counterclockwise so that thread jumps back towards me a little bit. And then I'm just going to take a couple of thread wraps, keeping that on the top. And after I take those couple of thread wraps, I can pull on the material to try to minimize the amount that I'm going to need to cut off and clean up. Then I'm just going to go ahead and take this. Again, I've got this in my hand and I'm pulling it up just to help keep this right on the top of the shank of our hook. And we're going to go fairly deep around the bend here. And then I'm just going to come right on back. And with that, we're sitting about right where I want to be. I'm going to go ahead and go back up forward a little bit, closer to behind the eye here. And then I'll just stroke those remaining fibers that were fighting me a little bit. But you want to be careful here. This is a size 14, so there's a lot of material can go on without bulking it up too much, but you certainly don't want to go beyond what you absolutely have to have. So just like a lot of the patterns that you will be tying up, going to put a lot of materials on at the very back end of the fly that will sort itself out in the end. The next material I'm going to tie in this is probably from 2 or 3 years ago. I tend to try to refresh my tippet material. This is just a 3X tippet monofill. I'll just get those couple of wraps on it. It's pretty slippery material. I can then draw it backwards just so I don't need to cut it off. And I'm going to want to have that secured back down right where we ended up with our Z yarn here, or our antron. So there we go. We've got another bit of material in place. I'm going to come back up to here. Next, I'm going to turn to some thin skin. I'm just using a green with black spots on it. Sorry, I say this all the time, but ironically, when I first started tying, I didn't actually know this, but this white stuff is backing, and you need to peel it off. So I tied up some pretty bulky flies with a lot of white on the underneath. Once you've got that kind of stripped off from the backing, I want that to be, you know, a little bit less than the gape of the hook. That's kind of my measurement here. So we're going to go ahead and tie this material on, and I really want this to kind of fold its way over the top of my hook here. So hopefully you can see that that's kind of wrapped itself on either side. I'm going to go ahead and move forward a little bit and secure the little bit that's there at the front. But from there, most importantly, I'm going to want to keep this material on the top, and it's going to hopefully cinch, not hopefully, it will cinch right around the shank of the hook here. And because this is going to be going up over the top of everything, we want that nice and centered over the hook here. With that, I'll just come back up just a little ways here. For dubbing, I'm actually gonna use a little bit of a blend here. I've got a sow scud pack here. I want the lighter olive kind of color of dubbing on this, but I don't mind it having just the smallest hint of some kind of copper. So I'm also going to grab just a tiny little bit, much less than I grabbed of the other. And I'm just going to kind of pinch those together. You can see I've got quite a bit in my fingers, but that's okay. We've got a lot of territory to cover. And I'll just blend these in my fingers just by kind of pulling them apart like that. And that's going to blend that more copper dubbing in with the more light olive color. Once I've got that ready to go, I'll turn my vise just a little bit, give myself a tiny little bit of extra thread, and I'm just going to go ahead and finger dub this on. At the end, we'll use a dubbing brush and brush out, you know, some of these fibers to give it a little bit of a scud kind of buggy look. But this, if I didn't say it before, is called the Barr's Net Builder, Caddis Larva. And caddis is a go-to, always. I always have them in my box ready to go. And there are three kind of categories of these larvae. One are what I would call a clinger. They kind of cling onto rocks on the bottom of the river. If you've ever pulled up a rock and looked underneath, sometimes you'll see one of these. You also have a kind of a free-floating caddis larva. They'll just kind of swim around and float around in the water column. And then you have this variety, which is called the net builder, and kind of like a spider. It's going to create kind of a webby infrastructure on the bottom of the water column, river, and food is going to get trapped in that kind of web net that this builds, and that's how it gets its food. So I've talked plenty now. Let's go ahead and get our dubbing started way back down here on the bottom, and I'm going to try to keep that tight just so we can keep that kind of oblong proportion. Some of that football oblong shape is already pre-made for us because we put some of those wraps of lead wire in place. You see with each turn around, I'm just tightening up that dubbing just a little bit. And I am going to take this pretty close to right behind the eye of the hook. So we're sitting about like that. We are going to tie in some legs here, and for that we're going to go ahead and turn to some ostrich plumes. So you can see I've moved my thread back quite a ways, maybe a third or less than a third. I'm just going to go with the black ostrich herl here, and if I can find it, I've already stripped off one of these herls, and not only stripped it off, but I've also, kind of like you would with a hackle, I've just pinched with my fingers and created a bare stem there for my tie-in point. So we're going to go ahead and get that attached back here where we want it to start. Let's take a couple of wraps there, and then I'm going to kind of move forward. Love ostrich. I hate ostrich. It is one of those love-hate relationships, at least for me. This material moves wonderfully in the water, so I love to turn to it. It's also very delicate, so it's very, very easy to break when you're tying. So this is where thread control and just being careful is going to be important. I'm going to throw a little bit of wax on my thread here just to create a little bit more of a tacky base for this herl to travel. And then I'm just going to relocate my thread back up near the eye of the hook. And sometimes you'll just want to let go because you're having so much fun you want to do it over again. So we'll get that kind of where we want it. I'm going to go ahead and take my thread and secure that down just with a couple of good solid thread wraps there. I'll take a wrap or two on the other side right behind the eye of the hook. With that, because this is so brittle, you can actually just rip it right off like that. And you can see I've got a few fibers hanging over the eye of the hook. I'll just go ahead and pull those backwards a little bit. Just work on capturing them. It wasn't overly messy, but that will help. So there you go. You're starting to see that pronounced lighter color with the darker color, make a little bit leggy with the ostrich herl. At this point, we're going to go ahead and reach down and grab that thin skin that we tied on earlier. And we want to pull that straight over the center of our hook here, over the top. I will pull it a little bit tight. I'm not going to pull it overly tight, just because I don't need to. We're going to secure this really well with our monofill or our tippet material. So mostly I just want to get this attached without covering up too many of the legs that we've tied on here. And then with that, I can just go ahead and come in with my scissors. And I want to cut this off pretty close, so I'll probably make a couple of cuts here rather than try to do it all at once. Just like that, and then I can turn my vise this direction and get that tied off. I'll just go ahead and take a few more wraps just to cover up those butt ends. And also to secure this. Okay, we're rounding the bend, both figuratively and literally. So we're going to use this 3X, and we're going to take some fairly open wraps, moving up. Being 3X, you can crank down on this stuff pretty hard and help create more of that segmented look. The only area that I would suggest you be a little bit careful of is when you're pulling tight, you can inadvertently pull the thin skin in the direction that you're tying your monofilament on. So I will kind of lay it over the top where I want it, and then as it's coming back towards me, then I'll pull it nice and tight. So tight that I'm actually moving my vise around. So I'm just going to take these open wraps until I get right up behind where we put the ostrich herl in. From there, I'm going to kind of wiggle this through that ostrich herl a little bit. It's going to be a little bit more of an open wrap on this one. The only reason I'm wiggling that back and forth a little bit is to just try as hard as I can to not capture too many of those fibers, so we can have some of that leggy look going on. And I'm just going to go ahead and secure that monofill right behind the eye. And once I'm there, I can go ahead and turn my vise so that I can get access to that where that's tied in, and we'll just go ahead and snip that excess off. So that's kind of where we are right at the moment. Before we lose anything, right now is a good time to whip finish. So we're just going to go ahead and whip finish the head here. So I'll get a couple of wraps behind the eye, but most of these wraps I'm going to want to move back onto the body towards the bend of the hook. And I'm just going to go ahead and pull that nice and tight. So that gives me a sense of security and safety with that whip finish in place. We've got the knot in place. I'm going to just grab this thread cutter that will cut my thread off nice and close. Put it back just so I can see it, or I can find it again somewhere down the road. Now's the time to come in, and we're going to cut the Z yarn, and we don't want a lot of a tail. It's just going to have a small bushy tail here. Just about like that. And then, as I mentioned, I'll go ahead and try to tease out a few of the fibers of this sow scud, and I'm not trying to go crazy. I'm being very careful also of not going over the top of the ostrich herl. I want to call it peacock, but because it'll break it. And this is just going to give us that little bit of extra buggy look here. With that, it's time to color. I'm going to break out a black Sharpie. And specifically these segments that are over the ostrich, the black ostrich, I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to fill that in black with this Sharpie. So that it blends in very nicely all the way through. And with that, there you have it. There's the Barr's net building caddis. Wonderful fly. You want to have a whole, retinue of caddis patterns because they're pervasive and they're always a good go-to. This is going to work great as that net building caddis, but it can also serve as a scud. It has a lot of the same look as a scud. So throw yourself a hook in your vise. Give this one a shot.